In 1961, a woman named Loretta Combs fed a family of 8 in Pike County, Kentucky on $9 a week. She didn't have a freezer. She didn't have a car to drive to town more than once a month. She had a wood stove, a cast iron pot, a 20-pound bag of cornmeal, and the kind of knowledge that no cooking school has ever offered a course in. Number 22 on this list fed her children for under 15 cents. Number 8 grew wild along the fence line and didn't cost a single penny. And number 1, the meal that tops this list, is so deeply woven into the memory of rural America that people who grew up eating it describe the smell before they describe the taste. These 25 meals weren't elegant. They weren't the meals anyone wanted to be eating. They were the meals that kept entire families alive when the rent was late and the paycheck hadn't come. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 forgotten poor man meals from the 60s that are too good to forget. Number 25, water gravy on toast. When there was not any milk, butter, or meat in the house, there was still flour, water, and the drippings stuck to the bottom of a skillet. Your mother scraped those drippings loose with a wooden spoon, sprinkled in a tablespoon of flour, stirred it over low heat until the flour browned just slightly, then added water a little at a time until a thin gravy formed. She poured it over whatever bread was left in the house and set the plate in front of you without ceremony. In the hollows of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, water gravy was the last night before payday meal. It didn't have a real name in most households. Families called it gravy and bread because naming it something specific would have made it real. Would have meant admitting out loud that the cupboard was almost empty. A full skillet of bacon drippings, saved in a coffee can on the back of the stove, made this taste richer than it had any right to. One skillet, 5 minutes. A family could go to bed with something warm inside them. That was enough. Number 24, bread and milk. A bowl. A few slices of day-old bread torn into pieces, warm milk poured over the top, and sometimes a pinch of sugar if anyone thought to add it. That was supper. In rural homes across Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Ozarks of southern Missouri, bread and milk was the meal that appeared when the money ran out and the week had not ended yet. The bread swelled soft in the warm milk, going almost custard-like if you let it sit long enough. A loaf of bread cost 22 cents in 1962. A quart of milk was 25 cents. For a family of 6, that is dinner for under 50 cents. No stove required. No pots to wash. Old-timers across the southern mountains still eat a bowl of bread and milk before bed the way their grandmothers did. Not because they have to, because it tastes like safety. Number 23, cornmeal mush. On cold winter mornings across Iowa and Indiana, farmhouse kitchens smelled like nothing else. Your mother had started the pot the night before, stirring cornmeal into salted water over low heat until it thickened into something almost solid. By morning, it had set in the pan, and she sliced it cold, laid the pieces in bacon grease in the skillet, and fried it until the outside turned crispy and golden. You brought it to the table dripping with butter and maple syrup, or you ate it plain with nothing but salt. A 10-pound bag of cornmeal cost 53 cents in 1960. That bag could produce a week of breakfasts. In Amish and Mennonite communities across Ohio and Indiana, cornmeal mush stayed on the menu long after more prosperous times arrived, not because families still had to eat it, but because they had grown to love it. Jackson Cornmeal Mush, an Indianapolis company founded in 1896, sold the product pre-made in the refrigerated section of Midwest grocery stores for decades. Your grandmother knew what she was doing. The mush was better than the cereal in the box. Number 22, fried potatoes and onions. Every family had this, not a variation of it. This exact dish. You slice the potatoes thin, drop them in a heavy skillet with lard or bacon grease, let them go until the edges started to color, then threw in a yellow onion sliced into rings. The whole pan hissed and filled the house with a smell that still brings grown adults to a stop if they walk past a diner and catch it drifting out the door. A 10-pound bag of potatoes cost 53 cents in 1960. One onion was a few cents more. In farm communities from Ohio down through Arkansas, this was not a side dish. It was dinner. Some nights, it was the only dinner. Your mother never measured anything. She knew the pan size, knew the heat, knew by the sound of the sizzle when to turn them. She did not apologize. She set the pan on the table and everyone ate from it, and that was supper. Number 21, saltine crackers and milk. This barely qualifies as a recipe, and that is exactly the point. A sleeve of saltine crackers crumbled into a bowl, cold milk poured over the top, eaten before the crackers got too soggy. Some families added a little black pepper, some added a pinch of sugar. Most ate it plain because there was nothing to add. A sleeve of saltines cost almost nothing. Cold milk cost 25 cents a quart. In rural communities across the Great Plains, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, this was a late-night meal for children, a between-meals filler, or the last resort when supper had run out before everyone was full. It isn't so different from cereal, really, except there was no cartoon on the box, no toy inside, no advertising budget telling anyone it was special. It was crackers and milk, and children ate it and grew up strong and healthy, and most of them will tell you now that they still crave it on certain nights. Number 20, Hoover stew. During the Depression, people named this after Herbert Hoover because they wanted him to know what they thought of his presidency. The name stuck through the 40s and 50s and 60s, passed along in mill towns across the Piedmont and steel neighborhoods in Pittsburgh and Gary. You made it with whatever canned goods were in the cupboard. Macaroni boiled in water, a can of tomatoes dumped in, hot dogs sliced into rounds, sometimes a can of corn, sometimes a can of green beans, whatever was on the shelf. The rule was simple. Keep adding until the pot was full enough to feed whoever was at the table. A package of macaroni cost 9 cents in 1963. A can of tomatoes was 12 cents. Hot dogs ran about 30 cents for a package of 8. Dinner for 4 for under 50 cents. It was not pretty food, but it was hot and it was filling and it got everybody through another night. Families in the coal camps of Harlan County, Kentucky still remember the smell of it. Number 19, beans and weenies. This one had a proper name. Van Camp started calling their canned version beanie weenies sometime in the 1960s, and the name caught on, but families had been making the dish at home for decades before anyone put it in a can. You opened a can of pork and beans, sliced a pack of hot dogs into rounds, heated everything together in a saucepan over medium heat, and dinner was done in 6 minutes. In 1961, you could feed a family of 4 on beans and weenies for under 30 cents. In New England, it was a Saturday night tradition. In Indiana, it was a weeknight staple. In Texas, it was what you ate when the end of the month arrived before the paycheck did. Every region had their own version. Some families stirred in brown sugar and a squirt of mustard. Some added chopped onion. Some ate it straight from the pot. What nobody did was apologize for it. The children always ate every bite. Number 18, tomato gravy on biscuits. In the mountains of North Carolina and Southwest Virginia, tomato gravy was the summer answer to sausage gravy. When fresh tomatoes came off the vine in July and August, you chopped them and cooked them down in a skillet with a little bacon fat and flour until they thickened into a loose brick-red sauce. You ladled it over warm biscuits and called it breakfast or supper depending on what time it was. In the fall, when the fresh tomatoes were gone, you used a can of whole tomatoes and the gravy tasted almost the same. A bushel of garden tomatoes in rural Virginia in 1963 cost almost nothing because your grandmother grew them herself in a plot behind the house. A 5-pound bag of self-rising flour ran about 35 cents. Tomato gravy was the dish that used up what the garden gave in abundance and made it into something a family of 7 could share. The biscuits soaked up every drop. Nothing was left in the pan. Number 17, creamed chipped beef on toast. Soldiers called it something much less polite. In American households from Pennsylvania Dutch country down through the Appalachian Ridge, it was just what your mother made on the nights when nothing else was planned. Dried, salted beef, the kind that came in little glass jars at the grocery, shredded into a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, then poured over toast. A jar of dried beef cost about 39 cents in 1965. The sauce used milk and flour that were already in the house. The whole dish ran under 50 cents for 4 people. It was salty, it was thick, it coated the toast and stuck to your ribs, and by the time you finished your plate, you weren't thinking about what you were eating anymore, only that you were full. Families who grew up eating this still make it, not out of necessity, out of something closer to loyalty. Number 16, fried bologna sandwich. You are either nodding right now, or you have never been to rural Ohio. Your mother laid a slice of bologna flat in a hot skillet with no oil because bologna makes its own. The center puffed up like a dome while the edges curled and browned, and a ring of char formed around the outside. She popped the bubble in the center with a fork, let it lie flat again, flipped it once, and slid it onto white bread with a stripe of yellow mustard, and sometimes a slice of American cheese melted on top. In western Pennsylvania and the Appalachian communities of eastern Ohio and West Virginia, fried bologna was not a joke food. It was dinner. Bologna kept well in the icebox, cost much less per pound than any cut of meat, and could feed a family with a single package. Schools in the South served bologna cups in their lunch programs in 1963. Fried slices formed into little cups, mashed potatoes spooned inside, cheese on top. The children ate every bite and didn't notice they were eating poor. That is the best kind of cooking. Number 15, egg drop soup. This is the meal that appeared when the cupboard held almost nothing but still held eggs. You brought a pot of water to a boil, seasoned it with salt and pepper, threw in whatever scraps of vegetable were left, the tail end of an onion, a handful of dried pasta. Then you cracked 2 eggs and stirred them into the boiling broth in a slow, thin stream so they cooked in feathery shreds through the liquid. The whole dish cost pennies. In mining towns across Pennsylvania and farming communities in southern Illinois, this was the last night of the week meal when everything else was gone. It was hot. It had protein. It was better than it had any right to be. No cookbook told them how to make it. Hunger is a remarkable teacher. Number 14, pinto beans and cornbread. A pound of dried pinto beans cost about 29 cents in 1965. A box of cornmeal cost a dime. Together, they fed a family of 8 for 3 days and provided complete protein without a single piece of meat required. A woman in a coal mining community in Anawalt, West Virginia, soaked her pintos overnight, then simmered them all day long with a ham bone, a diced onion, and salt and pepper, and nothing else. The pot liquor, the broth the beans made as they cooked, was rich and smoky and the color of rust. The cornbread baked in the same cast-iron skillet her grandmother had used, greased with bacon drippings until the edges turned crispy, and the center stayed soft enough to crumble directly into the bowl of beans. Pinto beans and cornbread was the survival meal of Appalachia for more than 100 years. Families in the coal camps packed them in lunch tins and carried them into the mines. When Appalachian families migrated north to Cincinnati and Cleveland and Detroit in search of factory work, they brought this meal with them. A restaurant on Vine Street in Cincinnati called Tucker's served soup beans 7 days a week through most of the 1950s, because the customers who had come up from Kentucky and West Virginia needed to taste home. Here is what rarely gets said out loud. The meals that kept American working families alive for generations are the meals no food corporation can make a profit from. There is no brand loyalty in a bag of dried pinto beans. There is no advertising budget behind a box of cornmeal. The profit margin is pennies. That is why you do not see commercials for beans and cornbread. The meals that saved families are the meals that were never worth marketing. Number 13, dandelion salad. Number 11 on this list was free. That is not a figure of speech. Your grandmother walked to the edge of the yard in April or May, when the leaves were still young and tender, and she came back with a colander full of food that had not cost her anything. She tore the dandelion greens into a bowl, cut up some green onions, maybe laid a few slices of hard-boiled egg on top. Then she fried a couple strips of bacon in a skillet, pulled them out, and poured the hot drippings right over the greens with a splash of vinegar. The heat wilted the leaves just slightly, and the dressing came together in the bowl. In farm communities across Ohio, Indiana, and the Ozarks, this salad was on the table every spring, the first fresh green thing after a winter of canned vegetables and dried beans. It was vitamin-rich, and it was free. You didn't buy it. You found it. And it tasted like the whole winter was finally over. Number 12. Poor man's meal. Potatoes and hot dogs. This one had a name. Clara Canucciari, a woman who grew up during the Depression in New York and lived to 96, made this dish on camera for a YouTube channel she started in her 90s. Her video got millions of views because the people who watched it had eaten it too and had not tasted it in decades. You peeled and cubed a potato, fried it in oil with a chopped onion until it browned, then added sliced hot dogs and a couple tablespoons of tomato sauce and a splash of water to bring it all together. A potato, an onion, a few hot dogs, a spoonful of tomato sauce from a can. Dinner for four for about 15 cents in 1963. In Chicago's working-class neighborhoods and in the river towns of the Mississippi Valley, this was what you made when the week had run long and the paycheck hadn't arrived. It was filling, it was warm, it smelled like food, and the children always wanted seconds, which was the whole point. Number 11. Bread pudding. This is the meal that made something from nothing, and it is still on restaurant menus in New Orleans today, where they charge $14 a serving for what your grandmother assembled from scraps. You took whatever stale bread had gone too hard to eat as a sandwich, the ends of a loaf, the leftover biscuits from 2 days before, yesterday's cornbread, and you cubed it and soaked it in a mix of eggs, milk, sugar, and cinnamon. You poured it into a greased pan and baked it until the top turned golden and the center set. If there were raisins in the house, you put them in. If there was vanilla, you added a capful. If there was nothing extra, you baked it plain and it was still good. In the rural South, bakeries sold day-old bread cheap, sometimes half price. Thrifty women across Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee bought those bargain loaves and turned them into something the family asked for by name. That is the whole recipe: old bread, heat, and the refusal to waste anything. Number 10. Vinegar pie. When the recipe says vinegar pie, the first reaction is always the same. Your face does something. But vinegar pie is older than the Depression. Recipes for it appear in cookbooks as far back as 1859. It was born on the American frontier and in the homesteads of the South and Plains at a time when fresh lemons were a luxury most families did not have access to. You mixed sugar, flour, a tablespoon or two of cider vinegar, butter, and sometimes eggs into a pie shell and baked it until the filling set into a sweet, slightly tart custard. In the Ozarks of southern Missouri and Arkansas, this was the Sunday dessert when there was no fruit in the house and no money to buy any. Vinegar cost almost nothing. Sugar was cheap. The result tasted like lemon pie to families who had never had lemon pie, and that was good enough. Laura Ingalls Wilder was said to have loved it. That is the kind of detail that makes a dish worth remembering. Number 9. Chocolate gravy on biscuits. You might not have heard of this one unless you grew up in eastern Kentucky or the surrounding mountain communities stretching into West Virginia and eastern Tennessee. Chocolate gravy is not a tourist dish. It is not in any fancy cookbook. It is a breakfast made from cocoa powder, flour, sugar, milk, and a little butter, cooked in a saucepan until it thickened into a pourable, rich sauce that went over split biscuits the way sausage gravy did everywhere else. Food writers have traced it to eastern Kentucky specifically, calling it a regional creation of the mountain communities there. A can of Hershey's cocoa cost about 20 cents in 1964. A bag of flour was a staple already in the house. For families in the isolated hollows and ridge communities of the Appalachian coalfields, chocolate gravy was the Sunday morning treat. The children woke up to the smell of it and came down the stairs before they were called. That happened every time. It still does. Number 8. Wilted lettuce salad. This is the one that grew behind the barn or along the creek bank. Not store-bought lettuce. Wild greens, whatever the spring put out in the yard and along the fence rows. Poke salad, lamb's quarters, early wild lettuce, dandelion greens past their prime. In rural communities across North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee, women knew which greens were good to eat and which to leave alone, and they passed that knowledge to their daughters the way other families passed down recipes. You fried a few strips of bacon, poured the hot drippings over the greens with a splash of vinegar and a pinch of sugar, and the heat wilted everything down into a soft, tangy salad with a little crunch left from the crispy bacon on top. It was free food. This is where the story of poor man cooking goes quiet. A generation of American women knew how to feed a family from the land around them. What grew in the yard, what was edible along the fence line, what the garden offered in abundance, and what the woods offered for nothing. That knowledge existed in these communities for centuries. It came from the Cherokee people who had lived in those mountains long before European settlement, and it was passed into Appalachian foodways generation by generation. When those families moved to the cities for factory work, some of that knowledge went with them. Some of it didn't. The generation that followed in the 1980s and 90s didn't know what a poke plant looked like. That is not their fault. But something real was lost. Number 7. Stewed tomatoes on toast. This is the dish that could go either direction, breakfast or supper, depending on what else was on the table. You opened a can of whole tomatoes, broke them up in a small saucepan, added a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, a little salt and pepper, maybe a splash of butter if there was any, and let it cook down until the tomatoes were soft and swimming in their own thick juice. You poured it over white toast and it soaked through and the whole thing turned warm and sweet and a little tangy, and you ate it from a bowl because a fork wasn't enough. A can of tomatoes ran about 12 cents in 1963 in rural Georgia. A loaf of bread was 20 cents. Dinner for two for under 40 cents. In lean months, when the garden had run out but the pantry still held canned tomatoes from the summer before, this was the meal that appeared on Tuesday night with no fanfare and no apology. Your mother set it in front of you and you ate it, and you were glad. Number 6. Potato soup. A woman in a small farming community in the Missouri Ozarks in 1967 could feed 6 children on a soup built from 4 potatoes, 1 onion, a little bacon grease, and a quart of milk. You boiled the potatoes in salted water until they were just tender, left some in chunks, and mashed others against the side of the pot so the broth turned creamy on its own. You added the milk, adjusted the salt, let it come up just short of a boil, and set it on the table with a pan of cornbread alongside. Nothing thickened with flour, nothing dressed up with cream. A 10-pound bag of potatoes cost 53 cents. A quart of milk was 25 cents, soup for 6 for under $1. Potato soup was the meal that appeared in every immigrant kitchen that came to America. German families in Ohio, Irish families in Massachusetts, Scots-Irish families in the Appalachian Hollows. Each group made it slightly differently, but the principle was always the same. Potatoes were cheap. They kept through winter. They could be stretched with milk and onion into something warm and filling enough to call dinner. The recipe adapted to what was on hand. Bacon grease instead of butter, wild onions from the yard, a little flour stirred in if the broth needed body. You could not patent it. You could not brand it. It was just potato soup, and it was enough. Number 5. Cornbread crumbled in milk. You made cornbread for supper. There was some left over. After the children were in bed, your grandmother sat down at the kitchen table, crumbled the cold cornbread into a tall glass, poured cold buttermilk over the top, and ate it with a spoon while the house went quiet around her. In the mountains of eastern Tennessee and the Appalachian communities of southwest Virginia, this was not a recipe. It was a habit. Something a person did at the end of the day the way you might have a cup of tea. The cornbread swelled in the milk and softened, and the whole thing tasted of corn and the slight tang of buttermilk and something almost sweet. Stone-ground cornmeal in 1964 ran about 8 cents a pound. Buttermilk was a byproduct of butter making and cost almost nothing at a local creamery. Elderly people across the mountain south still eat cornbread and milk as a before-bed ritual. Ask them why, and they will look at you like that is the strangest question anyone has ever asked. Number 4. Macaroni and tomatoes. This is one that got passed over when prosperity arrived and never came back, which is a shame. Cook macaroni until soft, drain it, stir in a can of diced tomatoes with all their juice, a little salt, a little pepper, sometimes a pat of butter. In mill towns across the Carolinas and the textile communities of Georgia and Alabama, this was the Tuesday night meal. Quick, simple, cheap, made from 2 pantry staples that cost almost nothing. A pound of elbow macaroni ran 12 cents in 1963. A can of tomatoes was 12 cents. Dinner for four for under 30 cents. The tomatoes cooked into the pasta and gave everything a sweet, slightly acidic flavor that was better than it sounds, and better than anyone who has never eaten it would expect. A whole neighborhood knew this dish. Somehow it never made it into any cookbook worth mentioning. Some of the most useful meals never do. Number 3. Crackers and peanut butter. A jar of peanut butter cost about 35 cents in 1962. A sleeve of saltines was under a quarter. Put them together on a plate, and that was an after-school meal, a quick supper, a packed lunch, or the only option left at the end of the week. Peanut butter worked. It had protein. Crackers had carbohydrates. The combination kept children going through afternoon chores, through homework at the kitchen table, through long evenings before bed. In agricultural communities across the South and Plain states, Georgia, the Carolinas, Kansas, Oklahoma, peanut butter was the protein source that never ran out. It kept in the pantry through summer heat without spoiling. It cost less per gram of protein than anything else in the store. It didn't require refrigeration or cooking or any skill to prepare. You spread it with a butter knife and handed it to a child, and that child ate it and did not feel poor. That is the definition of a useful food. Number 2. Chicken and dumplings. This was the Sunday meal. This was the company meal. This was what your grandmother made when she wanted to say something she didn't have the words for. She took an old hen, a laying hen that had stopped laying, tough enough that no one wanted to fry it, and boiled it for hours in salted water until the meat fell from the bone and the broth turned golden and the whole house smelled like something sacred. She fished out the bones, stripped the meat, put it back in the pot. Then she mixed flour, a little shortening, and buttermilk into a stiff dough, pinched off pieces, and dropped them into the simmering broth where they puffed up thick and soft and soaked through with chicken flavor. In farm communities across Georgia, Tennessee, and the Piedmont of North Carolina, chicken and dumplings was the meal that marked occasions. Not special occasions, but the ordinary ones that families needed a meal to hold them together. Somebody came home. Somebody needed feeding. The old hen went in the pot. The women who made chicken and dumplings weren't working from a recipe. They were working from knowledge that lived in their hands, the feel of the dough, the sound the broth made when the dumplings were done. A whole chicken cost about 60 cents in 1965. A bag of flour and a quart of buttermilk cost under 30 cents more. A meal that could feed 10 people for under $1, made with an animal that had already earned its keep, laying eggs for 2 years. Nothing was wasted. That is what good cooking has always looked like. Number 1. Fried potatoes, onions, and eggs. This is the one. This is the meal that sits at the top because it appeared on more tables in more parts of rural America in the 1960s than anything else on this list. You sliced the potatoes thin, fried them in bacon grease in a cast-iron skillet until the edges turned brown and the house filled up with a smell that has no equal. You threw in the onions halfway through. When the potatoes were done, you pushed them to the side of the pan, cracked 2 or 3 eggs into the empty space, broke the yolks if there were children who didn't like runny eggs, and let everything finish together in the same pan with the steam and the grease-carrying flavor back and forth between the eggs and the potatoes. You didn't need a plate if there was only one skillet and only one table. Everyone gathered and ate from whatever was in front of them. A family of 5 could eat this breakfast or this supper because it worked for both. For under 20 cents in 1963. Not 20 cents per person, 20 cents total. There is no restaurant in America that has figured out how to charge appropriately for what that 20 cents provided. Not the warmth, not the smell, not the fact that everyone at the table was fed and together, and the night was not so dark after all. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. The fried potatoes and onions, the beans and cornbread, the bread and milk before bed. Sit down at the table, not the couch. Set a place. Eat slowly. Because these meals weren't just about being poor. They were about a generation of women who refused to let poverty win, who stood in kitchens with empty cupboards and found a way to put something warm on the table every single night. They did not measure. They did not apologize. They fed their families with whatever the pantry offered, and they got up the next morning and did it again. Tell me in the comments which one your family made. I want to know if beans and weenies gets more love than fried bologna. I want to know if anyone else's grandmother had a bread and milk night that nobody talked about in front of company. Because these are not just recipes. They are proof that the simplest food, made with almost nothing by women who had everything to lose, can still be the best meal you ever ate. Celery and cheese soufflé brought elegance to an inexpensive vegetable that most people considered only a snack or soup ingredient. Finely chopped celery was sautéed with a bit of butter and folded into a fluffy base of beaten eggs and grated cheese before being baked until the top rose and browned. Despite its sophisticated appearance, the ingredients were simple and affordable, making it a popular choice for dinner parties on a budget. The soufflé delivered a gentle crunch from the celery against the airy texture of the eggs, surprising guests who expected something plain. Because the recipe relied on pantry staples like milk, eggs, and a small amount of cheese, it fit perfectly into the frugal cooking philosophy of the time. Home cooks loved that it felt fancy without requiring costly ingredients or specialized equipment. Served with a crisp salad or a slice of toasted bread, this dish turned an ordinary evening into a special occasion and demonstrated how a humble vegetable could take center stage in a memorable meal. Pickled watermelon rinds turned what many would throw away into a sweet, sour preserve that families treasured during the Depression. When fresh fruit was too precious to waste, thrifty homemakers saved the tough white rind of watermelons. These rinds were boiled with sugar, vinegar, and spices until they softened and took on a tangy sweetness. Stored in jars, they became both a condiment and a dessert, brightening up otherwise bland meals. Children loved them for their unexpected flavor, and adults valued how nothing went to waste. Victory gardens often produced watermelons, and in households where money was scarce, even the rinds had value. Pickled watermelon rinds were served alongside beans, bread, or meats when they could be found, making ordinary meals feel more lively. Many families kept recipes for these preserves, passing them down as reminders of how every scrap could be used. The dish was both resourceful and flavorful, embodying the resilience that defined Depression-era cooking. Ramen noodles were the dinner of desperation that somehow became a ritual. A block of dried noodles, a packet of salt and spice, and 3 minutes in boiling water. That was it. That was the whole recipe. And yet, it kept showing up in pantries, college dorms, first apartments, and homes where money ran out before the month did. You could dress it up, sure, but no one was fooled. It was hunger food, dressed in hot broth and convenience. And somehow that truth only made it more familiar. You slurped it straight from the bowl, steam burning your face, the broth clinging to your lips. Sometimes you added an egg, sometimes hot sauce, but most times, you just made do. The noodles were limp, the broth was salty enough to sting, but it was food, and food meant one more night survived. You did not eat it because you wanted to. You ate it because it was all you could afford, and you learned to love it anyway. Fried bologna chips were genius, born out of boredom and thrift. You took a slice of bologna, cut it into quarters, and tossed it into a hot skillet until it curled up like bacon and popped around the edges. The smell alone could pull anyone to the kitchen. The sizzling sound was pure comfort, like something important was happening on the stove. A paper towel would soak up the grease, and before long, you'd be snacking on salty, crispy bites that tasted like meat candy. It was perfect for game nights, cheap beer, or payday eves when you wanted something crunchy without opening a bag of chips. Some folks dipped them in mustard, others stacked them between white bread with a smear of mayo. It wasn't fancy, it was food that did its job. Fried bologna chips were the working-class answer to bacon, proof that good flavor didn't need a big budget. It was something to look forward to after a long week, and in its own greasy way, it made life taste a little better. Evaporated and powdered milk were the quiet heroes of the poor man's pantry, the kind that didn't look like much but made all the difference. When fresh milk was too expensive or too far to fetch, these tins stepped in. Powdered milk mixed with water could be used for baking, breakfast, and even feeding babies when nothing else was around. Evaporated milk had that thick, sweet flavor that made coffee richer and pies creamier. It was comfort in a can. People learned to trust it because it never spoiled and could sit on a shelf for months. During lean winters, that security meant everything. You'd see families mix a little milk powder with oats, stretch it into gravy, or stir it into mashed potatoes. It might not have been the farm fresh kind, but it carried the same warmth. For many, those tins meant nourishment and dignity in a time when both were scarce. Fried potatoes and onions were the poor man's hash, a skillet full of sizzling honesty. You sliced the potatoes thin, tossed them in a pan with oil or bacon grease, and added onions until the whole house smelled like something was finally cooking. It was loud, smoky, and always worth the wait. The edges got crispy, the centers stayed soft, and the onions caramelized just enough to make you forget there was no meat. There was no recipe, just instinct and repetition, the kind passed down by watching, not reading. One pan, one burner, and the hope that there was enough to go around. You flipped it with whatever spatula had not melted yet, served it right out of the pan, and ate it fast before the crisp turned to mush. This was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, whatever you needed it to be. You could dress it up with ketchup or cheese or just eat it plain. No one judged. It was filling, cheap, and tasted better than most things you could afford. In the right moment, it tasted like comfort. In the wrong one, it tasted like the only option. But either way, it got the job done. Beet and potato hash celebrated color and economy in equal measure, offering a hearty skillet meal from two of the most affordable vegetables around. Diced beets and potatoes were pan-fried with onions and a bit of oil, or leftover drippings until the edges turned golden and crisp. The beets added a deep ruby hue that stained the potatoes with a cheerful pink, making the dish as attractive as it was filling. A sprinkle of vinegar or a dollop of sour cream brought brightness to each bite, proving that frugal cooking could still deliver vibrant flavor. This hash was often served as a meatless main course or topped with a poached egg for extra protein, making it ideal for households watching their grocery spending. Gardeners loved it because it used ingredients that stored well through winter, ensuring a dependable dinner even when fresh produce was scarce. Beet and potato hash remains a classic example of how mid-century cooks turned basic staples into something comforting, flavorful, and visually striking without spending more than a few coins. Rutabaga hash was a clever dish that made the most of rutabagas, which were cheaper and more plentiful than potatoes during the Depression. Families would chop the firm root into small cubes, frying it with onions and whatever fat they could find. The rutabaga softened and browned, giving a texture and taste that mimicked potatoes closely enough to satisfy hungry families. Sometimes scraps of bacon or ham were added for flavor, but more often it was just the vegetables alone. The hash was hearty, filling, and adaptable, often appearing at both breakfast and dinner tables. Since rutabagas grew well in harsh conditions, they were dependable crops when potatoes ran short. Many children grew up not realizing their parents had been serving them substitutes, because the crispy fried cubes tasted so much like the real thing. Rutabaga hash showed how families made necessity feel normal, turning cheap vegetables into meals that could carry them through some of the hardest years in memory. Biscuit dough pizza boats turned canned biscuits into dinner for a crowd. You'd flatten each one into a little bowl, spoon on tomato sauce from a jar, sprinkle shredded cheese, and maybe add a slice of pepperoni if you were feeling fancy. Pop them in the oven and watch as they puffed and browned, smelling like pizza night on a dime. Kids loved them because they were small enough to hold, and parents loved them because they cost next to nothing. They looked cute, tasted amazing, and disappeared before they even cooled. It was the kind of meal you could make out of leftovers and pantry scraps without needing a recipe card. The 1980s were full of little tricks like this, turning store-brand dough and canned goods into a moment of joy. Biscuit dough pizza boats weren't just food, they were a celebration of what imagination could do on a shoestring budget. Spoonfuls. Dried saltfish was a poor man's meat, cheap, salty, and ready to last through any storm. Before refrigeration, this was how families near the coasts stayed fed all winter. Fishermen would pack the catch in layers of salt until the flesh turned firm and dry, locking in the flavor. Once you had it, all you needed was water and patience to bring it back to life. Rehydrated, fried, or stewed, it carried the taste of the sea and the grit of survival. Poor households found ways to stretch even a small piece into a full pot of chowder or beans. The smell might have been strong, but so was the satisfaction. Salt fish connected entire communities, from the docks of New England to the rural South, where people learned to turn scarcity into tradition. It was proof that with enough salt, skill, and determination, nothing had to go to waste. Television dinners were what happened when the future met the food budget. Frozen meals in foil trays, stacked in the freezer like little time capsules of convenience. Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, peas or corn, a square of apple cobbler that always burned your tongue. You pulled it from the box, popped it in the oven, and waited. No prep, no planning. Just peel back the foil and pretend you were eating like everyone else. These dinners were born in the 1950s, but they stuck around because they made sense. Especially when you worked late or your parents were too tired to cook, or there just was not enough of anything to make a real meal. The food never looked like the picture. But it was hot. It had variety. It felt like a feast when you only expected a sandwich. You ate it in front of the television, a tray on your lap, the glow of the screen making it all feel a little more okay. These dinners were never about flavor. They were about escape. Parsley noodle pudding brought a delicate herbal note to the classic baked noodle dish, turning inexpensive staples into a fragrant supper centerpiece. Wide egg noodles were cooked until just tender, then mixed with milk, eggs, a little butter, and a generous handful of freshly chopped parsley before baking to a golden finish. The custard base held everything together while the parsley added color and a bright, garden-fresh taste that lifted the entire dish. This pudding was equally welcome as a vegetarian main course or as a side alongside roasted vegetables. Because the ingredients were inexpensive and easy to keep on hand, it fit perfectly into the thrifty mindset of 1960s households. Home cooks appreciated how it could be assembled in advance and baked just before serving, freeing time for family or guests. Children enjoyed the mild flavor and silky texture, while adults admired its simple elegance. Parsley noodle pudding remains a quiet reminder that with a little imagination, even the most modest pantry can produce a meal worth remembering. Homemade crackers were one of the simplest yet most practical foods people baked during the Depression. With store-bought crackers and snacks out of the question, families turned to flour, water, and a pinch of salt or lard to make thin crisps. Rolled flat and baked until golden, they provided crunch and variety in a diet that was otherwise dominated by soft, starchy foods. Often, children would snack on them plain, while adults used them to stretch soups, broths, and thin stews. They could be topped with whatever was on hand, from drippings to a smear of carrot marmalade, but even alone they were satisfying in their simplicity. Families appreciated how they required little fuel and ingredients, and they became a staple for households that could not afford bread every day. Homemade crackers reflected resilience, showing how even the most basic pantry items could be transformed into something useful. They were not glamorous, but they were dependable, which is exactly what people needed most. Canned milk corn chowder was a soup that hugged you from the inside. You'd open a can of evaporated milk, pour it into a pot, add a few handfuls of frozen corn and some instant potato flakes, and let it all come together over a low flame. The result was thick, creamy, and comforting, the kind of meal that tasted richer than your wallet said it should. It warmed you up fast and made you feel like you had something special on the stove. This was a dinner for cold nights, small paychecks, and big appetites. Even without bacon or cream, it had depth, thanks to the sweet corn and that canned milk tang. Served with a few crackers or a slice of bread, it made a full meal out of almost nothing. Canned milk corn chowder wasn't just food. It was a reminder that with a pot, a can, and a little patience, you could turn scarcity into comfort. Cornmeal was the magic dust of poor households, cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly useful. A single sack could turn into mush for breakfast, hoe cakes for lunch, and cornbread for dinner. Farmers used it, miners used it, families swore by it. Cornmeal was filling, nutritious, and worked with just about any leftover you had lying around. It was the one ingredient that could carry you through a whole week of hunger without complaint. People used it with lard drippings to make golden cakes crisp on the edges and soft in the middle. For others, it meant a pot of warm corn mush, sweetened with molasses or salted for a savory twist. Kids grew up on it, and mothers stretched it with water when milk was gone. When the pantry looked bare, cornmeal never disappointed. It was the friend that always stayed. Its grainy texture and rich smell of roasting corn were the scent of home for millions. Even today, there's something grounding about a skillet of cornbread, reminding us how far thrift and a bit of grit could take a person. Caraway cabbage stew showcased the old-world flavors that many American families rediscovered in the 1960s while keeping costs firmly under control. Shredded cabbage simmered slowly with potatoes, onions, and a sprinkling of aromatic caraway seeds until the vegetables softened and the broth turned fragrant. The caraway lent a gentle licorice note that lifted the humble ingredients, creating a stew that was both comforting and unexpectedly complex. A small amount of butter or oil added richness without driving up the price, and the dish required only a handful of pantry staples to feed a crowd. Many families with Central or Eastern European heritage embraced this recipe as a taste of tradition, while others simply enjoyed its hearty simplicity. Served with rye bread or a slice of cornbread, caraway cabbage stew delivered warmth and satisfaction during cold months. It remains a reminder of how immigrant flavors blended seamlessly into American home cooking, offering deep taste and nourishment from ingredients that were inexpensive, widely available, and easy to store through the winter. Salted popcorn supper might sound like a snack today, but during the Depression it often stood in for a real meal. Popcorn was inexpensive, easy to make in large quantities, and filling enough to take the edge off hunger. Families would pop big bowls of it, sprinkle salt over the top, and gather around to share it for dinner. While it lacked the nutrition of meat or vegetables, it was a warm, shared experience that brought families together. Children saw it as a treat, while adults knew it was simply necessity disguised as fun. Sometimes popcorn was paired with milk or molasses water to add substance, but often it stood on its own. Neighbors also used popcorn suppers at gatherings, stretching limited food to feed a crowd. The dish represents how families redefined what supper meant when resources were at their lowest. It was proof that even the humblest food could provide comfort when eaten together, turning scarcity into moments of connection and shared resilience. Chili and crackers were the meal you made when you needed fire in your belly and not much else. Ground beef, a can of beans, tomato sauce, and every spice you could find in the back of the cabinet. You let it simmer until it thickened, bubbling and bold, the kind of dish that fogged up the windows and warmed up the room. You served it with saltine crackers, always saltines, stacked on the side or crumbled right in. Sometimes there was shredded cheese, sometimes a dollop of sour cream. But usually, it was just the basics, and that was fine, because chili did not need help. It had enough heat, enough bite, enough heart. You ate it with a spoon too big for the bowl and left the table feeling like you had won something. Maybe you had. Zucchini tomato layer. Bake turned overflowing summer gardens into a warm and colorful family meal that fit any budget. Thin slices of zucchini were alternated with canned tomatoes inside a buttered casserole dish, sprinkled lightly with breadcrumbs and a handful of grated cheese. As it baked, the vegetables released their juices, blending with the cheese to create a savory sauce that required no extra effort. This dish became a staple during peak harvest months, when zucchini was plentiful and nearly free from backyard gardens or neighborhood swaps. Home cooks appreciated how easily it adapted to what they had on hand, allowing the addition of fresh herbs or a scattering of leftover rice to make it more filling. Served hot with crusty bread, it offered a complete vegetarian supper that satisfied even the most dedicated meat eaters. The simple preparation, bright flavors, and low cost made it a dependable recipe that graced countless 1960s dinner tables, celebrating the abundance of late summer produce while keeping grocery bills comfortably low for hardworking families. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Egg salad sandwiches were the soft answer to a hard life. You started with boiled eggs, cheap, filling, easy to store. You mashed them with a fork, added whatever mayonnaise you had, maybe a pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, sometimes even mustard if you were fancy. Then came the white bread, thin and fragile, sticking to the egg like it was doing you a favor. It was cold, quiet food, not flashy, not warm, not especially comforting. But it filled the space between hunger and dinner. You ate it standing up over the sink or wrapped in wax paper at school. There was no crust if someone loved you. There was extra egg if someone loved you more. It was the lunch of the working poor, the dinner of those too tired to cook, and somehow it still managed to taste like home. The eggs were never just eggs. They were patience. They were leftovers. They were something made out of almost nothing. And when the fridge was empty except for a carton and a jar of mayonnaise, you knew what you were having. You did not choose it. You inherited it. Green bean croquettes brought new life to leftover vegetables, turning them into crispy patties that satisfied even the pickiest eaters. Cooked green beans were mashed with breadcrumbs, a beaten egg, and a sprinkle of herbs, then shaped into small rounds and pan-fried until golden on the outside and soft within. This dish allowed thrifty homemakers to stretch a handful of beans into a full meal, pairing perfectly with a dollop of ketchup or a simple white sauce. Children loved the crunch, and parents appreciated the low cost and quick preparation time. Green bean croquettes also demonstrated the growing influence of European cooking techniques in American kitchens, where frying and breadcrumb coatings were becoming increasingly popular. Served alongside a salad or a scoop of mashed potatoes, they brought variety and texture to the dinner table without adding strain to the grocery budget. Their lasting charm lies in the way they prove that even the simplest leftovers can be turned into something special when treated with care and creativity. Potato rarebit was one of the Depression's clever ways to make potatoes feel more special than they were. The base idea was to take mashed or sliced potatoes and top them with a thin sauce of cheese, milk, and spices. Cheese was often scarce, so the sauce was made with very small amounts stretched as far as possible, sometimes even flavored with mustard to give it more punch. The result was a dish that felt rich and indulgent, even though it used little more than potatoes and scraps of cheese. Families would bake or broil it to give the top a golden crust, making it even more appealing. It was filling, cheap, and versatile, perfect for serving a large family. Children especially loved when potatoes got transformed this way, since it was a rare chance to enjoy something creamy and flavorful. Potato rarebit may not be common today, but it was beloved back then. Butterbean burgers were the quiet champions of the broke man's dinner table, turning pantry scraps into something worth savoring. You'd start with a can of butter beans, mash them until smooth, and mix in breadcrumbs, an egg, and a pinch of salt and pepper. When fried, the patties crisped up perfectly, the edges golden brown and the centers creamy like mashed potatoes. The beans brought a rich, earthy flavor that made you forget there wasn't any meat involved. You could serve them on bread with mustard, stack them like real burgers, or eat them straight from the skillet with a fork. They filled you up fast and cost next to nothing, a miracle in itself. Families loved how far one could go, and kids didn't mind because they tasted good. It was one of those rare recipes that started from desperation but stayed for its flavor. Butterbean burgers proved that meat wasn't the only thing that made a meal feel whole. They were born from necessity but carried pride, the sound of sizzling oil marking another night conquered. Poverty taught people to adapt, but these burgers taught them to thrive. Fried pinto beans were the real muscle behind every hard-time meal. They were humble, sure, but they were also one of the most important foods ever stocked in American pantries. Poor men relied on them because they were cheap, filling, and versatile enough to become anything, from stews to soups to spreads. You could buy a big sack of dried beans for a few cents, soak them overnight, and stretch one pot into several days' worth of dinners. When meat disappeared from the table, beans stepped up. Mothers would season them with salt pork or just a spoonful of lard, maybe toss in an onion if they had one. The result was hearty and comforting, proof that flavor could be coaxed out of almost nothing. Beans didn't just feed stomachs, they fed communities. Churches, farms, and neighbors shared sacks during bad winters, knowing that beans meant everyone would eat. The smell of a bean pot simmering on the stove was a signal of warmth, of life continuing even when money was tight. They were the kind of food that asked for patience but gave back comfort in return, a true testament to the art of surviving with grace. Potato soup was the warmth you clung to when the cold came early and the paycheck came late. You peeled potatoes with dull knives, boiled them in water, and added onions if you had them. The broth was made from milk, or sometimes just more water and hope. It was not fancy. It was not thick. But it was hot and filling and honest. Some families added cheese or bacon bits if they had a little extra. Most just salted it until it tasted like something. You ate it slowly, holding the bowl in your hands like it might warm more than just your fingers. Leftovers were poured into jars and reheated for the next night. It was the kind of soup that stretched itself to meet your needs. It never judged you for having nothing else, and in that way, it did more than feed you. It forgave you. Hot dog fried rice was the 1980s answer to fast food when nobody could afford the drive-thru. You'd grab the leftover rice from the night before, toss it into a skillet, and chop up a few hot dogs to throw in. The soy sauce packets saved from cheap takeout finally earned their keep, sizzling as they hit the pan. The smell filled every corner of the kitchen, salty and smoky with a little sweetness from the rice. If you had an egg, you'd crack it right in and stir fast, watching it turn the whole thing golden. If you didn't, no one complained. The hot dogs carried enough flavor to make it feel like a real meal. It looked humble, but it tasted like triumph. Families made it at the end of the week when groceries ran low, and somehow it always hit the spot. It stretched scraps into dinner, turned leftovers into pride, and reminded everyone that creativity was just as filling as wealth. Kids didn't know it was poverty food. To them, it was comfort on a plate. Hot dog fried rice was the flavor of resilience, sizzling proof that even struggle could taste good if you knew how to fry it right. Molasses water was one of the simplest Depression-era energy boosters, and it carried a surprising amount of cultural weight. White sugar was often scarce and costly, but molasses was cheaper and packed with minerals like iron, which people desperately needed. Families would stir a spoonful of molasses into a glass of water, creating a sweet, dark drink that was both energizing and inexpensive. Children drank it before heading to school, and workers often relied on it to get through long hours of labor. It tasted strong, sometimes too strong for delicate palates, but its sweetness made it more welcome than plain water. Molasses water was also used as a quick fix when other drinks like milk or coffee were out of reach. For many rural families, it became a symbol of thrift and nourishment, stretching the value of every ingredient. It was not a luxury or even a treat. It was a necessity, one that reminded people of the importance of resourcefulness. In its simplicity, molasses water reflects how people created sustenance out of almost nothing and carried on despite hardship. Instant coffee meat rub was one of those oddball ideas that somehow worked. You'd mix instant coffee crystals with sugar, salt, and a pinch of flour, rub it on cheap cuts of meat, and throw it in the oven or pan. The coffee acted like a smoky glaze, turning the outside dark and caramelized while hiding the fact that the meat was tough as rubber. It was a poor man's barbecue, full of flavor and pride. Families used it for pork, chicken, or whatever protein happened to be on sale. The smell filled the house like something from a steakhouse, and everyone gathered around pretending it was a special occasion. Even if the meat was chewy, no one complained. The magic of that bittersweet crust fooled everyone into believing it was better than it was. It was one of those small miracles from a time when making dinner meant making do. Now, I am not a doctor or a dietitian. This is not medical advice. But the women who made these meals knew something about feeding a family that no cookbook has ever been able to put into words.